So we're on DAF Mem Zayin Amud Aleph, and what we were discussing yesterday is a brisa that has a little bit of ambiguity to it, but what's clear is that there's a machlokus between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. The brisa first started off by telling us that a ger has to be verified in some way. That if a person comes and presents himself as a ger, you have to verify his identity as a ger in some way. And that's learned from the word iticha, that he has to be muchzak lach, he has to be established as part of your community in order for you to accept him. And then the Brisa had said, now what if he brings witnesses with him? So that we have a pasuk to tell us where it says, V'chiyagur ba'artzachem, that if he lives in your land, so the word ba'artzachem teaches me that any convert in your land is acceptable. So basically, on the one hand, you need verification, but on the other hand, if he brings witnesses, that's sufficient verification in order to accept him. The next part of the Brisa then says, that only tells me that he's acceptable in Eretz Yisrael. How do you know that he's acceptable as a convert in Chutz La'aretz as well? In other words, if he brings some kind of verification that he's a ger, that you accept him. So therefore we have again the word iticha, which teaches me that wherever you are, you can accept a ger together with you. So then we have a statement from Rabbi Yehuda who says that on the one hand it says iticha, on the other hand it says ba'artzachem. So how do you reconcile that? So when he's in Eretz Yisrael, he needs to bring even a greater level of verification. He has to bring some document or some proof that he converted in Beis. Now this seems to be above and beyond the testimony of witnesses. And the Gemara is going to have to clarify this for us. But in Chutz La'aretz, he does not have to bring absolute verification that he converted in Beis. That's the first part of the Brisa. And then the Chachamim say, whether it's in Eretz Yisrael or in Chutz La'aretz, he has to bring that higher level of verification. That's the end of the Brisa, and that's where we're up to yesterday. Now we're going to analyze the Brisa. So, first of all, the Gemara says, and this is now on the 6th line of the Gemara in DAF Mem Zayin, Bahu ve'edav imo kra lamali. Now, why do you need a pasuk to tell me that it says ba'artzachem? You always accept someone as long as he's in your land. So that means to tell me that as long as he comes with witnesses to testify that he's a ger, then we accept him as a ger. What do you need a pasuk? The Torah always says that you rely on two witnesses' testimony. So Amar Rav Sheishes da Amri, you would be able to understand the rest of the Brisa. That's why the rest of the Brisa says, but you need additional verification even beyond the two witnesses. Then we have the word ba'artzachem in the pasuk, which taught me ainli ela ba'aretz b'chutz la'aretz minayin tamulomar iticha b'chol makom she'iticha. The next part of the Brisa said that only tells me that we accept a ger if he visits us in Eretz Yisrael. How do we know that we accept a ger with the proper verification even in chutz la'aretz? And therefore the Torah tells me iticha. Now, if you recall, the Brisa had invoked the word iticha in the pasuk for a different teaching, that we don't accept a ger just by virtue of the fact that he identifies as a ger. He has to be muchzak, he has to be established in our community first. And yet now we're bringing the word iticha to tell me that as long as he has verification, we accept him as much in Chutz La'aretz as in Eretz Yisrael, which is a different teaching. How can we use the one word to teach me two different things? So that's the Gemara's question. V'ha'afikte chada, v'ha'afikte, we already used it. So the Gemara answers, chada me'iticha, v'chada me'imach. The Gemara changes the girsa, but this is Rashi's girsa, that we have two psukim that have talk about gerim. One is the pasuk that we quoted yesterday, v'chiyagur iticha ger ba'artzachem, that when a ger lives in your land, and there the word iticha is used. And then we have another pasuk, which is in Vayikra Perek Chafei, which says ger v'soshav v'chai imach, that the ger shall live with you. So as long as he lives with you, then it doesn't matter where in the world he lives, as long as he's with you in your community, you have to accept him, as long as he provides proper verification. Canada, or whether it's in Eretz Yisrael, provided that he brings us some level of verification. And what Rabbi Yehuda says is that in Eretz Yisrael, unification. You have to bring proof that you converted. So what are you going to do with the word ba'artzachem, which according to Rabbi Yehuda tells you that there's a distinction between Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz? The Gemara answers, Hahumi boile da'afilu ba'aretz mekablam geirim. The salkadaita chamina mishum tivusa de'eretz Yisrael kamegairi. That, I'll tell you why I need ba'artzachem. It's a chiddush. It's not that there are different standards of acceptance in Galus versus Eretz Yisrael, but rather I might have thought that we don't accept Geirim in Eretz Yisrael at all because of the great life, great quality of life that exists in Eretz Yisrael, because after all, Eretz Yisrael is Eretz Zavas Chalav Udevash. So who wouldn't want to live in Eretz Yisrael when Israel is in its heyday? If you're living in Saudi Arabia or Jordan or Syria, who wouldn't, as a goy, want to live in Eretz Yisrael, where the quality of life is so much greater? And therefore, you might think that a person would not be accepted because there's so much incentive to lie, because you have a higher quality of life. So therefore, the chiddush is that even though there are possibly ulterior motives, we still accept the ger as long as he brings verification. And furthermore, even today, the Gemara is speaking about Talmudic times, where Eretz Yisrael is not as lush and fertile as it once was. It's no longer the Eretz Zavas Chalav Udevash. It's no longer producing more than other areas of the Middle East. There still is an incentive for a person to want to immigrate to the land of Israel because it's a welfare state. In other words, other societies in the Middle East do not offer charity for the poor as a required part of living in the state. So there's no leket shichacha in Peya in Syria. You don't have to, if you're a farmer, you're not forced by law to leave a portion of your field to the poor. Whereas in Eretz Yisrael, you are. So a guy who wants to be able to live off of welfare would say, I might as well move to Eretz Yisrael. I'll at least be able to survive there, even as a poor person. And yet, so therefore you might think that even today we shouldn't accept them. If they come to Eretz Yisrael, Kamash Malan, that we do. Amar Reb Chia bar Abba, Amar Reb Yechanan, Halacha bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz. The way I'm interpreting the Bryce, if I'm interpreting it correctly, it's not enough to bring witnesses who basically give you hearsay. You have to actually bring some writ or some other verification that you're actually a ger. And the Gemara says, Pshita, isn't that obvious? Yachid v'rabim halacha kerabim. But isn't that obvious? Don't we? Anytime we have a machlokus between the chachamim and one individual tana, we paskin like the chachamim. So if you're just telling me we paskin like the chachamim, what's your chiddush? The Gemara says, Mahu detema mistaber time of the Rebbe Yehuda to komisaya elei koroi kamashmon. No, because since the word ba'artzachem in the pasuk seems to side with Rebbe Yehuda that there is a distinction between how you accept gerim in Eretz Yisrael versus how you accept them in Chutz La'aretz, I might have thought that. Because Rabbi Yehuda has the force of the pasuk behind him, we paskin like him. That's what Rabbi Yochanan is coming to dispel. Tana Rabbana. Now, as I mentioned when we started, there are so many very important halachas in this DAF today that are halacha l'maisa for the laws of Geras. So it's a good DAF to be here for. Tana Rabbana. Ushvatetem tzedek bein ish uvein achiv uvein gero. The Brisa uses the pasuk that says, "You shall judge justly between every man and his fellow, including the ger." And from here we learn, Amar Reb Yehuda, ger sheniskar bebeistin hareza ger, beino levein atzmo eino ger. That this teaches me that there has to be a beistin, because it's talking about adjudication in the context of the ger. So you see that just like adjudication needs 3 judges, so too does gerus require 3 judges. But if a guy converts on his own, and he comes to us and he says, I was Megayer, but I did it outside of beistin, we don't reckon with that at all. We don't accept that. And therefore he's not a kosher Kohen. He's believed to say that. But it's only the Chachamim who disagree and say that a father is not believed for his son. But here you clearly see that Rabbi Yehuda holds that a father can testify not only on behalf of himself, his own personal status, but on his child's personal status. So how can you tell me that Rabbi Yehuda above does not accept the testimony of this guy for the sake of his children to say that he's a goy and his children therefore are also puzzle? Lidivarecha Obed kolchavim ata ve'ein edus la'obed kolchav. So the first answer is, it's not a contradiction. Here, it's worse. When the guy says, I really am a goy because I never had a kosher conversion, what he's essentially saying is that I'm a goy. And if I'm a goy, you can't accept the testimony of a goy. So because you can't accept the testimony of a goy, he's got to catch 22. That's why you can't passel your children. A Jew can identify the status of his children, but a goy is not his testimony is not admissible. So I believe you for your own sake that you're a goy, because that's called shavya nafshi chaticha disur, as Tosfos points out. You're basically reflecting upon your own personal status, and you're saying that you, for yourself, you're usher to the Jewish community because of your declaration. But you can't have any bearing on anyone else because your testimony is not admissible as a goy. Whereas if you're a kohen, your testimony is admissible. So that's answer number one. I'm going to hold off your question until I get to a point where I can take your question. Ravina Amar, Ravina has another answer. Ravina says, Hachi Ka'amarle. This is what he meant to say to him. In other words, so that's answer number one. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says the reason why it's different over here is because by your own testimony you're a goy. And that's not admissible. But Ravina gives a different answer. He says, Yesh lecha banim hein. Yesh lecha b'nei banim hein. That really the story wasn't that Rabbi Yehuda asked him only if he had children. He first asked him, do you have children? And he said yes. And then he asked him, do you have grandchildren? And he said yes. So Amar lei, neman ata lifsol banecha v'i ata neman lifsol b'nei banecha. So this is what Rabbi Yehuda told him. I paskin, based on the pasuk Yakir, that you can identify the status of your sons and your daughters. That's perfectly fine, but you don't have the ability to identify the status, the personal status of your grandchildren. And therefore, I'm just explaining it according to Tosfos now. If your children have children, then your testimony is not admissible at all, because by accepting your testimony about your children, you're also tainting your grandchildren. And therefore we don't accept your testimony. But if your children are young enough that they themselves have not yet married and had children, then I will accept your testimony for your status and your children's status, because a father can passel his own children. The thing he cannot passel are his grandchildren. And so therefore the difference between the previous brisa, the story with Reb Yehuda, and the story of the latter brisa is like this. In the story of the guy who said, I'm a goy, because I didn't have a kosher gerus, the reason why Reb Yehuda did not accept his testimony is because his children already were adults and had their own kids. And therefore the testimony is not admissible, because you cannot your testimony about your grandchildren is not admissible. But in the brisa, the second part, where it says that your testimony is admissible, is when your children do not yet have their own children. You don't have grandchildren yet, and therefore your testimony is admissible. So that's the way Tosfos learns. So we have two answers. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said the difference is one is a goy and one is a kohen, and therefore we don't accept the testimony of a goy for his child, but we accept the testimony of a kohen for his child. And answer number two is no, that's not the distinction. The distinction is rather whether we accept your testimony for your grandchildren or just for your children. Tanya Nami Hachi, but we have a brisa to support the second answer. Reb Yehuda Omer, Neman Alma Adam Lomar al Beno Katan Ve'ein Neman al Beno Gadol. The brisa makes a cryptic statement that according to Reb Yehuda, a man is believed for his older children, but he's not believed for his younger children. And V'Amar Reb Chia Bar Abba clarified what Reb Yehuda means. Amar Reb Yechanan, lo katan mamish, v'lo gadol mamish, ela katan v'yesh lo banim zehu gadol v'ein lo banim zehu katan. What we mean is, in both cases, your children are adults. But when we say gadol, we mean to say that he's old enough to have children, and he has children, and therefore, since you have grandchildren, you're not neman to passel your grandchildren. Nachman Bar Yitzchak. And in the final analysis, even though there's a brisa to support Ravina's explanation, we still paskin like Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak that when a person other than himself. So the Gemara says, but wait a minute, B'hatanya kavase de Ravina. But one second, the brisa, you just cited a brisa that shows that Ravina is correct, that it all has to do with grandchildren. It doesn't have to do with the fact that he's a goy. So how can you say that you're paskening like Ravina? So the Gemara says, like Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak. So the Gemara says, Hahu le'inyan yakir itmar. He says that latter brisa which makes a distinction between being believed for children versus grandchildren, only has to do with the Bechora, with the firstborn rights, and with identifying your child as being a Ben Grusha or Ben Chalutza. That's where we say that you're believed. However, when it comes to a Goy, we never accept the testimony of a Goy, like Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said. In other words, in the Gemara's final analysis, by a Yisrael, we make a distinction between grandchildren and children. But by a Goy, and that's what the Bryce is referring to, but if your guy testifies that he's a Goy, then we don't accept his testimony at all. Here's where I would take questions. Alan, if you still have a question.
I have it. It's too confusing in my head.
Okay, all right.
I have a question. What is the distinction between testifying about the children and the grandchildren? What's the logic?
Because it's a pasuk. The pasuk says that a father has the authority to identify the personal status of a child. And that's the only thing that a father has the purview over. Because normally, you're just one witness. How can you reflect on someone else's personal status? I can't go to Beis Din and identify someone as a mamzer, for example. My testimony is not admissible unless there's two witnesses. So the only exception that's made is for a father for a son, but not for a father for a grandfather for a grandson.
Because a grandson like anybody.
Yeah, right.
It's interesting. It calls him Ovid Kechavim Ata. He doesn't say you're not Jewish. He says you're Ovid Kechavim. Like he puzzles him completely.
Right, because right, and Ovid Kechavim means sorry, buddy, you're no different from any other goy on the street. Okay.
Ravina is saying a goy could have a testimony then. The second answer, Ravina.
Correct. According to Ravina, if a guy testifies that he's a goy, then he is believed to passel his son. He's just not believed to passel his grandson. But the Gemara says we don't paskin that way. We paskin that we don't accept his testimony even for his son because a goy's testimony is not good. Tana Rabbana. The Brisa now says, Ger Shabali Yisrael, this very famous Gemara. A non-Jew who comes to convert, Bisman has said today, Omrim lo ma'ra'isa shabasa lihiskayer. He says, what did you see? In other words, what in the world brought this idea into your head to decide to convert? I'ata yodea sheYisrael bisman hazeh devuyim, dechufim, sechufim, umiturafin, v'yisurin boin aleim. He says, don't you realize that the Jews today are filled with dread? They are rejected, they are downtrodden, they are torn apart, and they are filled with persecution. So im omer yodea ani ve'eni kedai mekablan oso miyad. Now if he says, I acknowledge that, and I'm unworthy of even being a martyr for the Jewish people. In other words, I'm not even worthy of even being persecuted as a Jew, because I am so lowly compared to my Jewish brethren. Then if he has that level of humility, we accept him immediately. Umodian oso mixas mitzvahs kalos mixas mitzvahs chamuros. We then educate him by teaching him some of the lighter mitzvahs and some of the heavy mitzvahs. In other words, we give him a fair representation of a full spectrum of mitzvahs. Umodian oso avon leket shichacha upeo meiser ani. And we also specify that there is a penalty for non-observance of the laws of tithing for the poor. Okay, and we'll get to that shortly. Umodian oso anshan shal mitzvahs. And then we tell him the general punishment for non-observance of mitzvahs, or for the violation of mitzvahs. Omrim lo heve yodea sha'at shelo basel amida zu achalta chelev iyata anush kares chilalta Shabbos iyata anush skila ve'achshav achalta chelev anush kares chilalta Shabbos anush skila. We say to him, listen, you should know, my friend, that up until you convert, if you want to eat chelev, you want to eat cheeseburgers, no problem. No penalty whatsoever. McDonald's is fair game. But once you convert to Judaism, you eat chelev, you eat forbidden food, you're going to get kares. And not only that, but up until now, you wanted to do whatever you want on Shabbos, no problem. You're a non-Jew. Once you convert, if you're Machal Shabbos, you get death by stoning. But just like we inform him of the penalties, we also have to be fair and not reject them entirely and tell him the reward for the righteous in Olam Haba. Amrim lo heve yodea sheho Olam Haba eno asui ela litzadikim. Yisrael bisman hazeh enam yecholam lekabel lo rov tova v'lo rov puran. So we tell him, listen, there's a great portion in Olam Haba awaiting a Jew who is righteous, far greater than a Gentile is capable of receiving. But also you should know that if you convert to Judaism, it'll never be totally great and it'll never be totally terrible. Because Hashem has promised us that in order to keep our Yetzer Hara in check, there will always be certain calamities that befall the Jewish people, but it won't be so bad as to utterly annihilate the Jewish people. So you got a buffer on both sides. It'll never go to either extreme if you as a Jew. And because he was so humble, we don't load him up with a lot of details or information. And kibel molinoso, and as long as he accepts the general parameters, we circumcise him immediately. I guess you got to tell him before you do that. By the way, there's just one more thing, right? And so then, nishtayru bo tzitzim hamaakvenas hamila choznu molinoso shnia. Then, and if after the circumcision, you can learn this really two ways. If he's already circumcised, but there's certain portions of the foreskin that still remain, you have to remove that. Or if you yourself circumcise him and then you realize that there's still portions of the foreskin that remain, then you have to recircumcise him until there's no longer portions of the foreskin. And then nisrapi matbilan osomiyad. And then you wait for a moment. It's really meant to read 3 because you need a bastin. They stand over him. Omodian oso mixus mitzvahs kalos mixus mitzvahs chamus. And at the moment that he's about to toivel, all they can see is her head. They can't see the rest of her body, even through the water. And the other way that some Bate didn't do it is they have her wear a terry cloth robe and go into the mikveh that way so that it's loose and the water can envelop her underneath the robe. So that way the Beis Din doesn't see her at all. But in either way, it is done with complete sneah so that the Beis Din doesn't have a chance to see her in an immodest fashion. But in any event, but you can understand, it's the same mikvah that a woman uses for nida is the same halachas of mikvah for a ger, and v'chol davar shechotzeis b'tfila chotzeis begeru ve'evid basel yiskayer u'modiim oso mixus mitzvahs kalos. Or mitzvahs chamurs. When we ask him, why did you decide to convert? And then, he says, I'm not worthy. And then we inform him of some of the lighter and some of the heavier. So my time, why do we tell him all of the heavy, scary mitzvahs? But there's just one thing he's not going to be able to get his head around, which is having to part with his money and give it to the poor. It's not something that he's raised, it's not a value that he's raised with. And therefore, that's why we have to make sure that he's ready to embrace the value of charity in order for us to accept him as a convert. Next, ve'ein marbin olav ve'ein medaktikim olav. We don't place too much of a burden of too much detail of educating him. We don't tell him every single detail. Amar Rabbi Elazar my kara. Where do you see that you don't have to tell him everything before he's megayer? Dichsiv atera kimis ametzes ilaleches ita batechdal daber eleha. From the story of Rus and Naomi, that once Rus demonstrated her that she was adamant about accompanying Naomi stopped talking. In other words, she didn't press her any further. So from here we see that at some point you don't have to pile on every single detail in order to accept a person for conversion. So you're going to ask me the question, that's Naomi said to her, we have a law called Tchum Shabbos, which means you're limited as how far you can travel. And so Ruth says, that's okay, wherever you go, I will go. If you can't go past a certain point on Shabbos, then I won't either. Asr lan yichud, she said, Naomi says to her, we're not allowed to seclude ourselves with a man. So Bashir Talini Olin, that's okay. I'll sleep where you sleep. I won't sleep in a place where there are other men. Mafgedinan sheish mitzvahs v'yud gimel mitzvahs. Sheish meos v'gimel mitzvahs. Then Naomi says, we have 613 commandments. Ruth says, that's okay. Amechami, your people are my people. We're not allowed to worship idols. That's okay. Your God is my God. Arba misos nimsru lebeistin. There are 4 types of death penalty when you don't observe the mitzvahs properly. She said, that's okay. From a higher form of misa and one for a lesser form of death penalty, but you're still put in a special segregated cemetery. So she said, that's okay. V'shomei kaver, and that's where I'll be buried. Miyad v'ateraki misametzes ivagomer, and then immediately Naomi saw that she was serious, she was adamant, and therefore she stopped speaking. She says, okay, I'm ready to accept you. Kibel molinoso miyad. So the Brisa then said that once the goy accepts upon himself all mitzvahs, we immediately circumcise him. So my time, what do you have to do it immediately? Like, what's the rush? The Gemara says, Shuhuye mitzvah lo mashina. It's a very important answer. It's a mitzvah to be magayer someone. Once you verify that he's serious and he's sincere, you're doing a mitzvah. So why would you delay a mitzvah? Mitzvah b'layot chal tach mitzvah. Don't delay a mitzvah. Next, nishtayir botzitzim hama'akven hamila. So if there's left portions of foreskin, then you have to redo it. Kidetnan eluhin tzitzin hama'akven hamila. Basar hachoifes rov ha'atara ve'eno ochel bitruma. V'amar b'yirman b'ya'aba amar rav basar hachoife rov gova shel atara. So number one, in defining what is called extraneous foreskin, it says that the extraneous foreskin that makes you considered uncircumcised. One opinion is if you have the entire circumference of the glans, which is the head of the penis, is partially obscure, covered with still foreskin, right? And then there's another opinion which says that even if only one portion of the circumference, there are many ramifications and many definitions of this halacha. Let's go on. Nisrape matbilan oso miyad. As soon as he heals, you take him to mikvah. So nisrape ilo, nisrape lo, my taima. Why do you have to wait for him to heal? Why can't you just take him immediately after the bris? The Gemara says, Mishum demaya marzumaka, because water, if modern medicine, maybe because the water's dirty. Perhaps that would be the reason, because there's bacteria in the water. But no, that's not the halacha. Once he's a Jew, even if he goes back to his old ways, his kiddushin is a valid kiddushin, and if he gives kiddushin to a Jewish girl, she'd have to get a get. The act of emancipation turns him into a Jew, even if he doesn't accept upon himself the mitzvah. So how can our brisa say the other way? Amar of Sheshas Lokasha Harab Shimon ben Elazar, the beautiful woman that you find on the battlefield, who's a non-Jew, and you can take her as your wife. So it says she shall cry for her mother and father for 30 days. But that's only true when she did not accept upon herself mitzvahs. Avol kibla aleha matbila umutar b'miyad. But if she accepts upon herself mitzvahs, to circumvent the 30-day waiting period in order to make her your wife, I have a very simple solution. Forcibly take her to the mikveh and toivel her as a shifcha, as your maid, as your servant. Then put her in the mikveh a second time to emancipate her, and that act of tvila, the second time, which emancipates her, automatically makes her into a Jew, even if she's not makabel mitzvahs. So you see that there's a machlokus between the Chachamim and Reb Shimon ben Elazar. The Chachamim say that even an Eved Meshuchrar is allowed to be married to her right away. So Omar Rava, so now Rava says, my time of the Reb Shimon ben Elazar. What's Reb Shimon ben Elazar's reasoning? D'chsiv kol Eved ish emancipate him by taking him to the mikveh, make him into a ben chorin, and automatically he becomes a Jew, even if he's not makabel mitzvahs. But via tamal ben ish bal karcho. But if he's just the son of a man, meaning that if he is not a slave, but rather he's just a regular Gentile, then you don't force